Today we examine three philosophical quotes that seem to have this element of fire in them. I'll start with a quote by Dogen. Dogen is a Japanese Zen master. He says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. When actualized by the myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and mind of others, drop away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. There's so much there that I want to focus specifically on only the second sentence. To study the self is to forget the self. First of all, to study has to be a choice. And for many of us, as we live our lives, we choose either deliberately or because we don't recognize that we have this choice, we choose not to do this studying. So, what does it mean to study? I think in a university setting or in any educational study, we assume that studying means or entails some kind of accruement of knowledge. Like we're building a repertoire in order to pass a test in the most literal configuration. But I think Dogen has a different quality to studying in mind. It's not an endpoint, it's a way of being. It's a way of living rather than trying to pass a test. Maybe to make this point a little more clear, I wanted to, since I think, Malik, you squeezed my shoes a little bit in our last conversation about David Foster Wallace, I thought this would be a good time to bring up the parable he opens up his commencement speech with, this parable of fish swimming in the water. And he says there's a group of young fish swimming along, and an older fish passes by and turns to the young fish and says, "Good morning, boys, how's the water?" They look at each other and say, "What the hell is water?" And I think implied is the question, how can we study something that is invisible to us? How can these young fish turn towards studying water when they don't even recognize that it's there? And implied in that question are more questions. What would it mean, for example, to take something that is invisible to us and make it visible somehow? To understand how water shapes what a fish is, how water gives the fish possibilities of its life, and likewise limits what the fish can and can't do. This requires a certain kind of study that I think Dogen is pointing to. Becoming aware that you have a choice to examine things more deeply that are not obvious to you. So that's the first piece I want to mention. The second piece that I think is not obvious is that there's this thing called the self in particular that we have an option of studying. And I think it's important to realize that to acknowledge that we do have, in the most traditional sense, a sense of self. It's a felt sense. It's a recognized sense. It's maybe in the simplest terms we think of it as the ego, but we certainly in non-philosophical terms have a quality about us that is recognizable to us. I think what's counterintuitive, of course, is that Dogen says to study this sense of self is to then forget this sense of self. Usually, again, we tend to study things to remember them, not to forget them. So it's a little bit counterintuitive is the best description I have. But that too gets a little complicated because if you've studied Buddhism, you might know that Buddhism has an underpinning of this concept of no self or not self. So what does it mean for a Buddhist teacher to say, let's study this sense of self which doesn't actually exist, or doesn't exist in the way you think it does? And I think that goes to some extent to this quality of studying. That when you study this thing, it begins to emerge in different ways that you might not have previously understood or acknowledged. And then from these entry points, you get all that follows in that quote, which we'll talk about at a later point. Maybe the last thing I'll say is, Dale, you wrote that when we interpret Dogen, you realize that the starting point is already being in the weeds, and that your task is not to get out, which I think is a lovely way of hinting at what Dogen is himself getting at, this counterintuitive sense of studying in order to forget. What's your interpretation and reaction to this quote?
Well, first of all, it's an absolutely fabulous one. You can ponder and think about for a long, long time. It's probably the most famous Dogen quote. But Christoph, that was great on the second line. That's the heart of it, I think. But let me focus on the first and third, the lines surrounding the ones you picked out. So the first one, just simply, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. Interesting in that what Dogen's saying immediately is that if you really want to see what Buddhism is about, if you really want to get on this path or way, you've got to study the self, right? That is essential to a Buddhist way of living, way of seeking how best to live. Then your sentence, to study the self is to forget the self. The third one goes, to forget the self is to be actualized by the myriad things. All right. So let me focus there. So what does it mean to forget the self? Answer, it's to be actualized by the myriad things, which is everything around the self, right? Everything, all these unbelievable numbers of things. So forgetting the self implies a shift of attention from myself as one being among many, one independent, isolated, but absolutely central entity whose sole task is to secure and enhance itself. From that perspective out towards all the things that are around me, all the things that are outside of me, that in fact really aren't outside. So, for example, water is in fact outside of me, but it's out there, but it's also inside of me. It's my inner constitution. The sun out there is in fact inside every cell of my body. It enters my body not just through sunlight, but through the organic matter that I digest. My parents are both exterior to me. They're different people, but they're totally in me by influence on my behavior, my language, my character in some deep sense. My teachers are within me. My friends, you three, are in me in a deeply influential way. I'm shaped by movies, music, literature, all now within me. So everything ever seen or heard or smelled or touched or tasted, now recorded in my brain as a part of me. I'm actualized, as Dogen says, by everything around me. It brings me to actually be who I am. So I am who I am through all of these connections. On my own, I'm nothing in particular. There's no such thing as on my own, in fact. Nobody's on their own. Nothing is on its own. So if I continue to understand myself the way I live my life as this separate entity, Dogen saying, I'm living in delusion. That's just wrong. It's just a mistake to go about living that way. But if I study the self and discover the self, I discover the enormous connections that allow me to be who I am. And in that sense, I can forget the self in this wrong-headed but very normal sense that we all live in, where myself is just me, separate from you and separate from all these things. I can forget that sense of self and see myself in and through all the things that compose me.
The 10,000 things.
Yeah, that's the literal from the ancient Chinese. The 10,000 things. I mean, 10,000 was the biggest number they could imagine. But in fact, we're talking zillions. Malik.
We'll return to this, I think, later, talking about Nietzsche on my side, this question. But the phrase that I think translates emptiness, maybe, or this actualizing a myriad things in Nietzsche and Zarathustra, and it's being knotted together. That I think is really, it's maybe if Nietzsche were at the moment of his thinking and writing in the mid-1880s going to be pinned down to like how he sees the world, I think it would sound a lot like this aspect of Zen. His metaphysics, in quotation marks, would be something like this, even while, as Dale is so good at pointing out, he's misunderstanding or having a poor access to Buddhism. So, yeah, but that's all. That I think this core idea is fundamental to both text traditions that we're looking at.
I'd like to underscore one more thing. Studying requires effort. That's the thing that the fish are not seeing at the moment. That they're so surrounded by their ordinary understanding that to even think that some effort would be required to, in a sense, to study their water is beyond them until the older, wiser fish swims along. And so I think that's what we're inviting everyone to do, is at least have the thought, in very classical Buddhist language, that's bodhicitta, the thought that studying yourself is not only an idea, but a good idea, does require some imaginative spark coming from somewhere, maybe the 10,000 things.
It's also true that these insights into selfhood, or what a self is, are now seeping into contemporary psychology and philosophy by way of Nietzsche and Buddhism. Nietzsche through then people who were influenced by him, moving up towards really contemporary thought. We're seeing more and more a Nietzschean Buddhist kind of understanding of the self as composed of different dimensions, different drives, different instincts, different senses that are working in conjunction with each other. And there's no one of them that is the deep self, and the self is always in process of change. That way of understanding who we are is headed towards a broad acceptance in contemporary psychology and philosophy, slowly.
I might even say that it's therefore appearing in our politics as well, which is a sense of, I guess, what people would call social construction as being like radical and thoroughgoing, right? So instead of like only in certain areas, but I think some aspect of this idea of being constituted by the, or actualized by the myriad things explains what is meant by things like structural racism, right? Like these structures constitute modes of subjectivity that have to be studied and understood, to be noticed even. Like, there's the metaphor that you're using, Christoph goes, that they can be invisible, that they're constituting us, they're creating subject positions, and it requires a great deal of work to try to understand how geography, climate, urban planning, access to food, roadways, and all that constitute you as a kind of person, and opportunities and everything else, and wealth concentrations. So I think not only is it seeped into philosophy, I think it's sort of made its way into a practical policy at this point.
We can imagine two people whose primary source of influence in thinking or in political thinking is Fox News or MSNBC. And, if you're raised on that, if that seeps into, that begins to constitute your identity, right? That's who you are. And if there's not breadth of perspective and there's not range, it's really difficult. It's going to be hard for you to get any perspective on how it looks from the other side.